Hi, we continue in 1 Samuel 22 today after David has left and gone into the forest of Hereth, and the scene turns to Saul, who is sitting at Gibeah under the tamarisk tree. So on the right side of the screen, you can see that we've been continuing to go through these scenes in these first chapters of this pursuit section here in chapter 21 and 22. And now we're in this section here where Saul turns paranoid against the Benjaminites. We're just going to look at verses 6 to 10 today. But this is in this sequence that will lead in chapter 24 and chapter 26 to the parallel scenes of David finding the anointed one of God in the cave and refusing to harm God's anointed, as a lesson for future people to not harm him as God anointed, but we'll get there in a couple of chapters. So as we've been going through, we've been looking at some of the questions that interpreters have to face as we enter into these scenes, and now we're down to these ones number 14 to 16 at the bottom of the page, which I'll move up a little bit here. So our scene starts today with Saul raging paranoiacally to his gathered servants. Why does Doeg report on David's meeting? What is his role in this here? And when Saul questions him, why does Ahimelech stand up for his relationship with David? And then the question of Doeg single-handedly killing the priest, but that'll come up in the video following. We'll just get to the question of Doeg's report here. And before we even get to that, we'll get at the question of Saul charging his servants with conspiring against him. And right at the beginning of our scene here, we hear that Saul heard, and that's brings up this rumors and indirect communication in this section. We're on this one here. But what's interesting on this one is our scene starts with Saul heard, but 2 verses later in verse 8, Saul will rail against his people. Why have none of you told me what's going on? So who he heard it from seems not to be those surrounding him in this scene, but somebody is working for him. Either that or he's just so paranoid he doesn't realize that his people really aren't against him. He just is seeing it that way. In our atlas, we need to look at a couple of things. Our scene starts here in Gibeah here, and the priests are described as at Nob. One of the challenges is that archaeologically we really don't know where Nob is. There's no place in modern understanding that's really has any certainty about it. But between our passage in 1 Samuel and some other references, it certainly seems to be just north of Jerusalem. So scholars have put it right in this location, which is to highlight it's not very far. This is just a few miles, but it's enough that when the message goes out for them to come, they're going to have time to think about what's going on there and prepare their defense. So that's what we'll see next time. And our section here is framed in a very interesting way. As Fackelman notes, there's a chiasm here that goes from verse 6 to 23. And it's outlined in an interesting way, not so much with parallel words we've seen, but parallel styles. So he notes it's framed by 3 lines of report with 7 lines of speech by Saul, and a similar 3 lines of report and 7 lines of speech by David at the end. And then the question of Doeg in the red there, and the question of Saul in the blue, which certainly fits this whole thing and puts Abimelech's defense in the center. But as I've noted, and you can see it right here, there's a smaller one built inside this, and it's not symmetrical with it in the sense that sometimes there's one chiasm inside another chiasm, where a piece of the earlier one is itself chiastic. John's gospel is that way all the time. But this isn't like that. This has a different center that radiates off against the symmetry here. And at the center of this one is Ahimelech inquiring of Yahweh, and the frame is Saul and his servants, or the king and his servants. I'd like to suggest that these two are interacting here to tell us something about what's going on in this scene. That just as Abimelech gives his defense, the chiasm is suggesting that he is inquiring of Yahweh in the same context where Saul is telling his servants to kill the priests of Yahweh. So this is quietly noting that Yahweh is behind Ahimelech, I'm sorry, that's a typo there, Ahimelech's defense, not Abimelech, and that we should trust that that's the side that we should be on if we're people of Yahweh in this story. One might ask, can we expect readers to be paying this close attention that they would hear all this in detail? And certainly an oral audience wouldn't be expected to. And scholars have not seen both of these, and they read very carefully with very well-trained eyes. All I can suggest is that if you watch a complex film by a master or a modern TV show, there are all kinds of details that even the closest viewer won't see, but they're there. The people who made the scene had to decide where every element of furniture and every tone and every lighting and every piece of music, every detail is there, but we just can't take it all in. And I'd like to suggest that these authors, not working with video as I am here, or color, or any of the other things that can give you many more choices than just having words do, especially words when you can't punctuate with exclamation marks or capitalization or do any of those other things like some people do when they type in all caps to yell at you in our modern form of things. they could create forms and chiasms that at least the closest readers could follow. And as Halpern and others have suggested, maybe this entire story is not meant for a public consumption only, but also for an insider audience who can read literally between the lines here and understand something that an immediate reading might not show. So it's there, and whatever we make of it is up to us as readers. I'd like to also highlight the key words here, which are so important. So in the scene we looked at previously, there really aren't any key words there, other than the fact that king is a key word in the scene that follows. This section was not really built around that. But we can see clearly the key words here in the scene we're going to look at here. Me, 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 me. And so many people are referred to as son, and referring to someone as the son of their father is a pejorative thing here. So Saul is referring both to David as son of Jesse and Ahimelech as son of Ahitub in a pejorative way. But what it's highlighting is the relationship of fathers and sons, because he's going to speak for all his father's house, the house of Ahitub, which we'll see is the house of Eli, which takes us all the way back to the beginning of the book of Samuel. And there are a couple of clues there that suggest we should be paying attention there. Also, we see in this how much Saul is referred to simply as king, not as Saul so much. He is Saul sometimes, as you see here, but king, 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 simply the king. Not King Saul or Saul the king, but simply the king in that role. And similarly, the priest, the priest, the priest, the priest, we see throughout here, even though Ahimelech is named as a person here several times, but clearly the priests as a group are what's named. And so those are the key words that we'll see, down to the horrible key words of attacked and killed when we get to that part at the end. So let's leave this up as we begin to look at our scene here and pay attention to some of the details that help illustrate what's going on. So as we note, the rumor mill here is immediately Saul knows where David is, or at least he hears where he's told he is. Whether he's located in that place or not, we don't know. Maybe they've caught him in Mizpah and he's moved on since there, so we don't really know that. Literally, the word for located is known, and that's been a key word in the broader section here. So the fact that Saul is sitting at Gibeah under the tamarisk tree recalls for careful readers this scene from chapter 14. Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah under the pomegranate tree that is at Migron. The troops that were with him were about 600 men, along with Ahijah, son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the priest of Yahweh in Shiloh, carrying an ephod. So there's this same family, although they're in Shiloh, not in Nob at that point. And that story of Saul sitting under a tree surrounded by his soldiers follows with the story of Jonathan and his young man taking on the Philistines in the pass successfully. So we're recalling there that Saul was surrounded by 600 men, but here he's surrounded by literally his slaves. The New RSV and many translations try to tame that by calling it servants, but the word throughout is slaves, and there's no question that's what it is. And that contrasts with soldiers, or 600 men who were with him earlier, who presumably were there because he was the king and they were choosing to be there. This is not a situation where there's a draft or a formal army like we'll see under Solomon, when he has a temple and a palace and a royal cohort and much of the bureaucracy that begins to form with an established monarchy. Saul is the beginning here, and there is no established anything, and so he had his soldiers who were around him because they saw that he was God's anointed. But now he simply has slaves around him, people who are doing his will because they have to, in whatever context we can understand slavery being there. So he's sitting under the tamarisk tree, where he'll be buried at the end of the book. Here's an image of a tamarisk tree in Israel today, and that one doesn't look like much you'd like to sit under. So here's another one that shows how it can be a shade tree from the hot sun. And it's sitting on the height here, which is Barama here on the height. And it's an interesting play on words with Ramah, the place that Samuel was from, the city that he's from. Here, it simply means height, a high place. And although it's not the case in the time of Samuel, later in the established monarchy, the Jerusalem-centered, temple-oriented writers will condemn very much people worshiping at any place that's outside Jerusalem, especially on the so-called high places, whether that's worshiping Yahweh there or some other local divinity, like the Astartes or the Baals. But that means they were worshiping outside of Jerusalem. But plainly, there is no Jerusalem temple yet, and we don't know that he's worshiping here, but he's sitting under that tree with his spear in his hand, not exactly the image for worship, but Saul always has his spear in his hand, as we've seen back since 1810 and these various places. And the slaves are standing around him. So here he is pictured under a tree, surrounded by his slaves, and And this is what he has to say to them. He said to the slaves who stood around him, repeated there for emphasis so we can see the scene, "Hear now," or "Hear please." The na provides a please in there. So it's an interesting stance that he has. And it's really where Saul's at. He has the power of imperative as king, but he knows that his word is not that strong, so he has to ask nicely, so to speak, "Please, hear please, you Benjaminites." And he identifies them as his fellow tribespeople. Notice they're not Israelites. They're not part of a larger coalition that one might think of as a national group, but simply his own tribal members that he's been a part of, that we've seen since 9/1. And he's calling upon them to side with him, and yet he's doing it in the most negative way possible. So hear now, you Benjaminites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands, commanders of hundreds? Which is plainly an echo back to the ironically called upon warning against having a king back in 1 Samuel 8, as we see. And my note below notes that Saul assumes that they all have mercenary motives rather than either personal loyalty or national pride. In other words, they're only going to be around the person that pays them the most rather than fighting against the Philistines or otherwise, because he certainly knows that the son of Jesse is part of the wider ethnic group, even if he's not a Benjaminite. But the element for fields and vineyards here echoes directly from 8:14. Let's go back and remember that here. The king will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers, etc. And you will be his slaves. And ironically, Saul has not given them any of these things, and they're still his slaves. At least we have no sense that he's given them anything. We have no reason to believe he has. So he asks this rhetorical question, will the son of Jesse give you all these things? But we hear no response. And he assumes the answer to his question, is that why you have all conspired against me? That the son of Jesse has somehow promised his own slaves to give them a reward, which is nothing we've heard of, and it's certainly not the way David's going right now. He's got his own group of 400, and we don't know what he's promised them, although later, as this continues, we'll see that they'll go around raiding towns and getting the booty and establishing themselves as a gangster band does, whether that's in The Godfather or in the book of Samuel. So it's not why. We don't even know that they've conspired. This is just him acting like Captain Queeg here in the Caine Mutiny, and you can see Humphrey Bogart in that classic role there. The word conspired calls back chapter 18, and we'll see it again in 2 Samuel when David's son Absalom gathers a conspiracy against his own father, the king, and everything will come back to David later, but not because of this. That is, at least in the text, attributed to the Bathsheba Uriah incident in 2 Samuel, much later. So notice how he follows up on his own questions here. No one discloses to me when my son makes a league with the son of Jesse. None of you is sorry for me. Notice how rhetorically here the repeat, no one, echoes what we saw in verse 2, all the men, all the men, all the men who came to David. So while David is exercising a magnetic pull on the discontented and marginalized, creating a new center around his leadership, Saul, who still is understood as a king, is exercising the reverse, a magnetic propulsion away from him, away from his own people, who he separates from him, and attributes to being with the son of Jesse, even though we have no reason to believe they are. So as David is pulling people to him, Saul is pushing people away from him. The word for discloses here literally is the phrase, nobody uncovers to my ears, twice in the verse. And it seems to be plainly not true because he does know where David is. So he's really just not in a rational state here. And certainly this is a rhetorical portrait to get anybody who still might feel sorry for Saul and think he should be king to recognize you can feel sorry for him because he's so paranoid, but he certainly shouldn't be king. When my son makes a league with the son of Jesse. So the word for covenant isn't here, but the verb is karet, to cut. So it cuts a relationship with the son of Jesse, which we saw back in chapter 18, and we didn't know that Saul knew about, but there it is. And notice in both accusations here, it's about his own son. It's about what Jonathan has done, not so much about what David has done. So none of you discloses to me what Jonathan has done, and none of you is sorry for me or discloses to me, literally is weak or sick, the absence of compassion perhaps, although the way it's phrased here makes it seem like it's pity, that my son has stirred up my servant against me. And notice again, he's attributing that David is only against him because it was Jonathan's idea, which is plainly not the case, but he's already seen that Jonathan had violated his will earlier by getting the troops to eat the honey when he'd had a ban on eating, and he should be warned that when the when the lot came up that Jonathan was the one and he ordered his soldiers to kill Jonathan, they refused, that would forebode what's happening here. But he's not alert to that. Stirred up my servant to lie in wait for me as he is doing today. And of course, it's the exact opposite. It's Saul who's lying in wait, hoping to find David, and David is trying to just get away from Saul. And as we'll see, when he has the opportunity to be lying in wait for Saul, to kill him, he could have, and he doesn't. Whether that's for selfish reasons or otherwise, we'll have to see when we get to chapter 24 and chapter 26. So now, at this point, we get Doeg. And we had reason to believe he was here. We saw in the previous chapter that he was described as the chief of Saul's shepherds or bodyguards, depending upon the translation. So it shouldn't surprise us that he's there. But he's described here as in charge of Saul's servants or slaves here, and specifically as slaves. So he's the slave master here, and he answers. And as Falkelman notes below before we listen to his answer, he not only omits David's lies, but above all, the questions which Ahimelech asked before his mind could be put at rest, and which are proof of the priest's loyalty. The result is his triple support of David appears to be treason to the king. And that's Falkelman's view, but as I've been trying to show you, Pamela Reese reads it exactly the opposite. I don't have an immediate quote from her here, but she reads it as Ahimelech and David were in on it, and he's not supporting Saul at all. He's testifying on behalf of David, but we'll get to that next time when we see his testimony. So here's what Doeg answers right now. I saw the son of Jesse, following up on the title that the king is using for David, coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, son of Ahitub. And he adds in the son of Ahitub here. So even if we hadn't heard the echo from chapter 14, now it's in the text that Ahimelech is part of the very line that the story of Samuel started with the priest Eli, who was cursed back then. And we can hear that curse right here from chapter 3. On that day I will fulfill, this is Yahweh talking through Samuel, against Eli, all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. For I have told him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them. Therefore I swore to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be expiated by sacrifice or offering forever. Now, that kind of theology, that a condemnation of one person's sins would lead to the condemnation of the entire sequence of their family, or at least 7 generations, was challenged in exile by prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah, but we're not in that context here. So readers who are aware of that from chapter 3 should understand, no matter what Ahimelech says, this entire line is condemned under the will of Yahweh. And yet, as we'll see, one of the priests will escape Abiathar, who will become one of David's royal priests. So we have to keep at one level this promise, at another level that there's still a sense that people can choose to do good for Yahweh or do good for the king and not suffer this ultimate fate that was promised earlier. So Doeg goes on to continue to what he reports to Saul here. And notice how this is different from what we heard in the actual scene. He inquired of Yahweh for him, which we had not seen. And my note below notes, it's a false statement added by Doeg, although commentators differ on whether it's true. And as my note below again from me suggests, it's ironic because if David had inquired of Yahweh, he might not have gone to Achish and had to play the madman. Yahweh might have told him a safe place to go. We hadn't heard that Ahimelech had inquired on him. And notice it says he gave him provisions, a generic word here. He doesn't talk about the difference between the holy bread and the ordinary bread, which, as I tried to explain in the last video, was key to the secret coded conversation between David and Ahimelech, highlighting that the holy bread represented the priestly approval for David's pursuit of the monarchy and escape from Saul. But Doeg just hears it as provisions. He doesn't hear the difference here. And as Samura notes below, provoking the suspicion that the priest was aiding David in military preparations against who else but Saul. But he does name that he gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine, although he doesn't have all the details there. And as the note from Bodner has, seems designed to drive home to the king his personal failure to deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines, in contrast to David's successes. And as we'll see, there are a number of revisions in this passage, including from Ahimelech, that will remind Saul of his own previous failures. So with that set up, the king is going to send for the priest Ahimelech, and I would just like to leave this video with the thought to Ahimelech and all the priests that were at Nob, what might you think and do when the word comes to you from just down the road that King Saul wants to see you and ask you questions about your relationship with David? And what might your stance be when you're taken before Saul? For that, we'll go to the next video. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.